O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls of good.
We sing Esplanade Despota.
Okay. So we're beginning a whole new series, and the series will be a study of the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John Climacus. Now, for those who had who looked at your email and you were on the email list, there was a PDF of this for free. It's supposed to be off.
Yeah, the Australian accent.
Yeah, I like the Australian accent.
There was a PDF that was sent around for free. Somebody had a question about copyright. Both the translator has proposed, as well as it's over 50 years, and therefore there's no problem with free distribution of the text. There's no copyright. And if you look in here, there's no copyright. So you can use that text. There are a number of different editions. This is the translation by Father Lazarus Moore. Father Lazarus Moore was a very interesting character who was a rather well-known in the English-speaking world. He lived for many years in India as a missionary, and he translated many things. He translated the Psalter. He translated the Arena by St. Ignatius Briancinina, and the Ladder of Divine Ascent. And his translation is the basis. This is his translation, and his translation is the basis for the version that comes from Holy Transfiguration Monastery, which has added some nice little line drawings and is a nice hardcover edition and costs double what this does. And I think they probably added some notes and cleaned up the text a bit. There's another edition. Somebody have the Paulist Press edition? What's that one? Yep. Okay, the Paulist Press edition is a more of an academic translation with lots and lots of footnotes and introductory material, and it's pretty decent for. I don't think it's quite as readable as this, but it's very good, and it's part of a whole series of editions of patristic literature that are really well worth having and knowing about that series. So I would encourage you to do that. First thing I wanted to talk about is to situate the Ladder of Divine Ascent within the history of the development of monasticism in the Orthodox Church. In the beginning of the life of the Church, if you remember in the book of Acts, it talks about all of the disciples of Christ living together and having everything in common and going from house to house, praying and eating together. In other words, life in community. Now, community life was something that was not unknown by any means within the Jewish community, and there were all sorts of different kinds of brotherhoods and things. And there were a number of antecedents to the apostolic community. And in fact, there were a number of antecedents also to some of the fundamental ideas and practices of monasticism. So, for example, the Qumran community, which produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, was a type of monastic community, only it comes from the 3rd century BC. It was a community of Essenes. They rejected the Second Temple. They rejected the priesthood of the Second Temple as corrupt and polluted, and the temple itself and its rituals as corrupt and polluted. And so I don't think they would set foot in it. But they also had a very tight and closed community of celibates who dedicated their entire lives to the study of the scriptures and the study of the sacred writings of the Qumran community, and lived in a tight community, supporting one another, sharing everything. One of the big differences between it and the early church was the early church was evangelical. In other words, it sought to bring people in and to proclaim the gospel and to let people know about the message of Jesus Christ and of salvation, and that they could come and join the church. Whereas the Qumran community was absolutely rigidly closed and exclusive. So the church was inclusive, the Qumran community was exclusive, which basically, according to one scholar that I read, prevents it from being considered an aspect of the early church, even though the central figure of the early church and the central figure of the Qumran community were both called the same thing, the teacher of righteousness. There's this one scholar who thought that the leader of both the Qumran community and obviously of the early church was James, the brother of the Lord. So undoubtedly he was the leader of the early church, the main leader of the early church. Peter comes later, but probably he was not the teacher of righteousness of the Qumran community, and we don't know his name, whoever that was. There was also, in the 1st century, 2nd century, a group in Egypt called the Therapeutae, or Therapeutae, in other words, the healers. And they lived in a tight community. They shared everything. They worshipped and prayed together. They ate together. They observed a whole liturgical life together. It's very likely that this group was a group of early Christians, but we don't know exactly. There's not quite enough information on them, and we know of them because of Philo. We know them because of some of the other early contemporary writers of the 1st and 2nd century. Now, there were also, among the Greek philosophers, there were Stoics. And there were Stoics who actually had the philosophers actually had a celibate lifestyle and lived in community, and especially with communities of their disciples, their students. And many of the ideas of the Stoics actually paralleled some of the ideas of the early church, which has led some scholars to think that, well, early Christianity is basically this kind of combination between Judaism and Stoicism and all of that. Undoubtedly, there's overlap, and there were, cultural ideas. It was the same culture, but who knows? Now, one of the most visible aspects of the monastic movement was that it put tremendous emphasis on celibacy, an emphasis on chastity. And if you, just looking at the New Testament writings, it's obvious that chastity is an essential Christian virtue. And the value of virgin chastity, virgin celibacy, is something that was highly, highly respected in the early church. In fact, there was a time in the 1st, 2nd century when Christians had to argue that marriage was actually acceptable, that it was better because there was a rather large party within the church that insisted on virgin celibacy. So we have, even in our marriage service, it talks about, having a chaste marriage and a bed undefiled and all of this kind of stuff. So it's so there is a history within the early church. Obviously, the church rejected the position that marriage was unacceptable for Christians, and accepted and blessed and consecrates marriage as one of the two ways towards salvation: monastic life in consecrated virgin celibacy, or a chaste marriage in which there is no adultery, no fornication, no nothing other than the relationship between the male husband and the female wife, to be very specific. Not that they had to be that specific at that time, because some of the modern ideas were unthinkable. However, this also has some very important Jewish antecedents, or antecedents among the Hebrews, one of which was the prophet Elijah, who lived in celibacy. Of course, there was St. John the Baptist, our Lord Jesus Christ, James, his brother, his mother Mary, of course, the apostles Paul and John, and then, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was thinking about this earlier today, actually. Were there any apostles who were married?
Peter. Yeah, I remember Peter Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. You have to be married to have a mother-in-law.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. But it's also, there's some debate in the tradition whether Peter continued to live with his wife as a wife or simply as a sister. And that is another practice. On Sunday they're going to bless a big statue of St. John of Kronstadt. On their wedding night, he announced to his new bride, "Honey, we're going to remain virgins and live as brother and sister." She actually took him to court.
Gosh.
If you can imagine. To ecclesiastical court.
What did the court decide?
I don't know what the court. I don't know what the court decided, but they stayed together, and they remained chaste. But that's not. I don't think our society could even begin to wrap its mind around that. It's. But obviously, chastity is a huge issue, and it's a huge. It's one of the primary values in Christianity. And either virgin chastity or chastity within a married relationship. And outside of those two things, there is no consecrated lifestyle. The church, it will bless people who are single, but it doesn't bless their lifestyle. Because everybody needs to have some kind of family. You need to be connected. And, I'm talking about monasticism, but on one hand, which is a kind of a spiritual family, on the other hand, you have the family, the natural family. And this is very important. as Christians, and it's one of our highest values. And part of that is the valuation of life. That abortion is something absolutely and utterly unthinkable, and a grave sin of murder. And it would be unthinkable to end the life of an elder because they're sick or because they're too much trouble or something like that. Euthanasia. But rather, all life is something valued. And it's also important, I think, for us to think about how important it is that the generations are together. But I'm not going to go off. I can go off for a while on the importance of marriage in the family. But these are also issues that you see in monasticism too. The issue of age and generations and things. So in the earliest church, you had the apostolic community. But then a little bit later, that kind of broke down as people, I don't know how long that early communalism lasted, but fairly soon, by the middle of the first century, you have St. Paul talking about communities of widows and virgins. Widows were those women who had been widowed and had nothing and had nobody to support them. And so the church would support them. Virgins were girls who decided to commit themselves to lives of celibacy and chastity, and would live in communities together. And actually, in the early church, all the way from the very beginning, you had these kind of orders. It later got a little more institutionalized, but for example, on Sunday you'll see an ordination, the ordination of Peter Gardner to the diaconate, right? He is not just being ordained as a deacon as something in and of himself, he's joining the order of deacons. When a priest is ordained, he's joining the order of presbyters. A bishop is joining the order of bishops. But there are also there's also the monastic ranks, the orders, monastic orders. There's also the lesser orders of subdeacon, reader, and in the ancient church there were also exorcists and catechists and doorkeepers, liturgical bouncers, basically. So there were all of these different orders, and they would all go to communion in according to rank, in order, so that everything was done in order. Men would stand on the right, women would stand on the left. You'd have, and how it all happened, I don't know exactly, except that it was by rank and by order. But these communities of widows and virgins were essentially the first organized celibate communities within the church. And it took the guys a little bit longer to get organized. Now, there was another aspect of life in the early church that is reflected heavily in the ideology of the development of monasticism, and that was martyrdom. Martyrdom was, you can't say it was an ever-present reality that afflicted the early church, because it was sporadic, and it was in different places at different times. But there were very few, if any, persecutions of all the Christians in the entire empire. It was just, one area or another, depending on where the emperor was and who he was focused on at the time, or some governor or somebody who had the idea to carry out a persecution. But it was, martyrdom was enough of a present and of a present threat that it had people kind of living always on the edge. And we saw this in Russia in the 20th century, because you would never know when you were going to get that knock on your door in the middle of the night, and the KGB would come and take you away, or take away your father or your mother or your brother or somebody, and you'd never see them again. There were, of course, the church suffered 20 million martyrdoms in Russia in the 20th century, just in Russia. So that was a real issue. And so what was the church's reaction? Well, you know how in Russia they had this old custom of people only going to communion once in a while, you know, once a year on their name's day or something like that, maybe on a great feast day or near a great feast day. They got rid of that and started going to communion every week. Every time that the chalice was brought out, people would be prepared to go and receive communion. Why? Because they never knew if they would be able to the next week. It's another aspect of martyrdom. You have to leave father and mother and brother and sister and wife and children and lands and possessions, right? Absolutely and completely. Or will you deny Christ for the sake of those things? You know, the threat of martyrdom kept people on the edge, and it kept them on a level of intensity of their faith that they had to be ready to renounce father, mother, brother, sister, relatives, friends, possessions, everything for the sake of the kingdom of God. And simply and freely offer themselves to God in martyrdom. I think that's an aspect of it we don't often think of. But that was, I think that underlies some of those sayings of our Lord in the gospel. So part of the idea of going into the development of monasticism was the memory and actually the experience of that intensity of faith and the willingness to renounce all the things of this world for the sake of the kingdom of God. And so monasticism eventually came to be called white martyrdom. You have the red martyrdom of blood, and then the white martyrdom of monasticism. And so that detachment, it had very deep it had very deep spiritual implications. And so if one became used to living like that, where you were detached from the things of this world, it was a radical change after the Edict of Milan in 312, where Christianity suddenly became legal and there were no more persecutions. Now, it had only been a few years, since the last major persecution, the Decian persecution, which was incredibly brutal. At that time, the churches had, there were church buildings, you know, the liturgy was developing, the church had structure, it had councils, it had... All of these things were developing, and the buildings were big public buildings. And so, for example, during that last persecution, 20,000 of the Christians of Nicomedia. Now think of how big a building you have to to cram 20,000 people into it. It's a big building, right? And it was burned. And they all perished. That was quite a, that was, and it's just beyond, it's kind of unthinkably horrible on one hand. On the other hand, you have to think of the valor of those people who were ready to give their lives for the sake of the kingdom of God. Just like in our own day in Egypt, the Copts are constantly being slaughtered for the sake of Jesus Christ and the sake of the kingdom of God, and throughout the Islamic world, and throughout Eastern Asia as well. So it's something very sobering. It's a kind of sobering that we don't often engage in our present circumstances. And the idea of that detachment is something very far from us. And yet, that detachment linked to self-denial is at the heart and the soul of the discipline laid on us by our Lord Jesus Christ and the gospel. Monasticism, first and foremost, is life according to the gospel, in a very literal interpretation. Not a fundamentalist interpretation in that particular sense, but in a very literal interpretation. For example, we just read in the daily readings, there are those who are made eunuchs by men, there are those who make themselves eunuchs, and there are those who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God. He let him who can receive it, receive it. That's a pretty wild statement, right? I mean, it's a pretty intense statement. That's, for example, one of the things that inspired many of the faithful across the ages to accept the cross of virgin celibacy and to remain virgin and celibate their entire lives. Another saying of our Lord, which is hard: if you love father or mother more than me, you're not worthy of me. If you love, wife or children or possessions or lands more than me, you're not worthy of me. These are. It was that saying that inspired Saint Anthony at the end of the 3rd century to accept the cross of monasticism and to go off and become a hermit. And there were already people living the solitary ascetic life at that time. Now, end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, so year 312 is when the persecutions ended. Probably 6 or 7% of the Roman Empire was Christian. The major centers, of course, were Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, Carthage, Damascus. Jerusalem had been obliterated and was a pagan city, but there was a Christian community there. Edessa in Syria, which is out at the headwaters of the Euphrates, and the whole Nile basin going south. Rome was a major center, but Carthage was also a major center. And eventually, another major center in the west was Lyon, in the middle of France. There were Christians in many other places. They've got evidence of ancient Christians in Britain from the 1st century, for example.
Would you include Ephesus?
Ephesus also was a major center.
Alexandria?
Alexandria was probably the most important Christian city at the time, followed by Antioch. And then there was Rome way out there on the other side of the world. We're very Byzantocentric here. There were 4 major language traditions. And the earliest level of the tradition was Aramaic, which was the language of in Jerusalem, the language of Greater Syria. Palestine is part of Syria. Aramaic eventually became Syriac as it developed. And the major center for the Syriac-speaking church, it had large populations in Damascus and in Antioch, but Edessa was the major center for the Syriac-speaking church and the tradition of the Syriac world. Of course, Greek. The New Testament was probably, some of it was written originally in Greek, some of it was written originally in Aramaic, and then translated very early. And so the Greek thought forms deeply, are deeply ingrained into the gospel message. Now, there's lots of debate as to where some of those philosophical ideas came from. Some scholars think that they came out of Athens, and the philosophers. But then some of the other scholars, and I think there's great validity to this, say that those ideas that were in Athens actually came out of the temple in Jerusalem. And that, so for example, if you read, I don't know, the Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Moses, all of these writings that reflect the first temple in Jerusalem, that tradition, and then you look at Dionysius the Areopagite, supposedly Neoplatonist. You see huge continuity, and there's no Neoplatonism that went into the composition of the Book of Enoch, for example, because that predates Neoplatonism some of it by hundreds and hundreds of years. So, what's the source of some of this? There's a lot that would point to the ancient temple. Not the second temple, the first temple. The Greek, the major centers, the first major center was Antioch. Antioch was the capital of the Roman Diocese of the East. The Roman Empire was divided into, I think, 3 major dioceses, which was basically regions. Each region had provinces in it. There was Rome, the Diocese of the West, Antioch, the Diocese of the East, and Alexandria, the Diocese of Africa. And so the Diocese of the East went all the way to the Persian Empire. The Diocese of Africa was the entire continent. And the Diocese of the West actually did roll over into Carthage and North Africa. But it was the Latin-speaking area. So the message of the gospel was in these four language traditions: Aramaic, Greek, Aramaic, Syriac, Greek, and Latin. And then then there were other sub-traditions as well. So, for example, in Antioch, you had a mixture of Syriac, Aramaic, Syriac, and Greek. And what happened was the words were Greek, but these were people who were raised speaking Syriac, and so the thought forms were Syriac or Aramaic, in other words, Semitic, but expressing a Greek idea, or using Greek words to express their ideas. In Egypt, you had people who spoke Coptic. Now, Coptic is its own unique language. It's the ancient language of ancient Egypt, and the word Copt is actually derived from the word for Egypt. Here again, the people were raised speaking Coptic. They learned Greek, but they were using Greek words to express their ideas, which were formulated in Coptic and then translated. So what we have in the early church is, there were all these different translations, and with them went all these different kinds of sets of presuppositions and cultural kinds of prejudices and cultural thought forms, which just because you were speaking the same language doesn't mean you necessarily were communicating. Somebody from England, somebody from New York, and somebody from Delhi may all be speaking English. But how well are they communicating? That's a good question sometimes. And they all may be native speakers, but it's because the ideas are deeply influenced by the cultural context. In Antioch, with a Semitic orientation, it was because Semitic is a very concrete language, and the basic presuppositions lead people who speak that language and who think in those terms, for example, to a type of interpretation of the scriptures in which they focus on the human life of Jesus and the teaching of Jesus as a man. It doesn't impinge upon their concept of his divinity, but they're they're deeply focused on his humanity, and they're deeply focused on what was he like as a man, and what was his teaching like, what was it like to live with him, and all of these kinds of things in a very concrete way. Egypt, on the other hand, and that by the way, that orientation and that kind of Semitic Syriac, it may have been expressed in Greek or it may have been expressed in Syriac, but it was the same basic ideas. If you go down to Egypt, you have a very different orientation. There's a chair here, and I'm sure there are more chairs that can be pulled up.
What would you say Ethiopia would culturally fall under at that time? Because it also adopted Christianity pretty early.
Right. Ethiopia had been evangelized in the first century. You had the Ethiopian eunuch, remember the story of Philip, and then the Apostle Matthew actually died in Ethiopia. He was martyred there. But Ethiopia largely remained partly pagan, partly Jewish. or rather Hebrew, rather than Jewish. And there's an important distinction. Judaism is the religion that came out of the exile from Babylon. The Hebrew religion, or the Israelite religion, was the religion of the first temple. And the Judaism that was in Ethiopia was First Temple Judaism, not Second Temple Judaism. Each village still had its Levites. They still had their high places. They still had their village Levites who would slaughter sacrifice the sheep and the animals, and they didn't have rabbis. They didn't have synagogues. They didn't have all of these things that developed in Babylon. So basically, the Judaism of Ethiopia reflects a period of the Judaism in Palestine from before 600 BC, before King Josiah. And so it was and the Jews in Ethiopia were a very, very important and fairly powerful part of society there. But Christianity but many converted to Christianity when they heard the gospel. And finally, the whole kingdom accepted Christianity around the year 320. Now, the Roman Empire didn't accept Christianity until 381 as its official religion. And Armenia was about the same, and Georgia in the 320s. So it's pretty interesting. Fascinating history, and that was about the time that the Christians took the Ark of the Covenant from the Jews and have possessed it ever since in Ethiopia. So, for example, in Egypt, getting back to where we were, you had Alexandria. Alexandria was a major Hellenistic city, meaning Greek city. The major language was Greek, but the people were Copts, Egyptians. But because it was this huge cosmopolitan center, which was the main center of trade for the Eastern Mediterranean, it had vast numbers of people of every different race and ethnicity and language and philosophy and religion passing through it. It's hard. I mean, New York is probably one of the closest things you could imagine, and like Alexandria of the first century. Rome was more isolated, than they were way off in the west. And it too was a great cosmopolitan center, obviously, as the capital of the empire. But it was a little bit more homogeneous than Alexandria was. Egypt had traditionally mystery religions, and so did Syria. But the Egyptian mystery religions had the cult of Isis and all of these various things. It predisposed, you could say, the people to a certain kind of approach to Christianity. And that was a mystical approach to Christianity. Also, you had a huge Jewish population in Alexandria. From the time of Alexander the Great, there was a large, very large Jewish settlement, actually, probably from much earlier than that. But Alexandria was the place where the Septuagint was translated, where the Hebrew scriptures, such as they existed in 300 BC, were translated into Greek. So it was this major center. It was this major center for Judaism, and that also had a very important role in the history of Christianity. The Coptic culture went all the way, basically, to Upper Egypt. In other words, to the south end of Egypt, and where it crossed into Sudan, and then they had their own culture, which also was Christian from a very early time. You know, the 7-foot-tall guys who roam around naked. You know, you've seen the Nuba. They were Christians at one time, all the way down to into Egypt or into Ethiopia, and so you had these various cultures along the way. So one of the interesting things archaeologically is that in Upper Egypt, in other words, in southern Egypt, you had a Jewish temple. Now, from the year 600, there could only be one Jewish temple, according to the decree of King Josiah. Why was there a second Jewish temple on Elephantine Island in the Nile, in Upper Egypt, including a history of the presence of the Ark of the Covenant? Very interesting question. But the Jewish community was as far south as almost near the Sudanese border. So it was a big community. Starting in the 1st century BC, you had the development of Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism was a synthetic religion, or you can't even call it that. It was these groups of syncretic groups which pulled together paganism and Judaism. In other words, traditional Egyptian paganism, Judaism, Mithraism, which is, I think, Persian, you know, all of these various, and came up with these mystery cults and with these, these secret systems of knowledge, which the adherents to the cult would have to memorize. Usually it was the names of the demons that you had to ascend through to get to the highest heaven, so that you could escape the evil demiurge who was the one who created this, the material world. And you can read all about that in St. Irenaeus Against Heresies. But this kind of, which was, St. Irenaeus died in 211. So, kind of an old...
His text survived.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So these were like what we would think of in modern terms as New Age.
Exactly.
But we're probably they were more creative. It seems like they had more.
Yeah, well, they didn't have... although Buddhism and Hinduism were also present in the Eastern Roman Empire, and there were Buddhist missionaries in Palestine, actually. It was a different mix than the New Age that hit the West, but it's the same kind of thing. And usually they had little groups of middle-aged ladies who were around a guru or a teacher. Yeah.
When did you say that this started up Gnosticism?
This started before Christianity. This started before Christ.
What time frame?
2nd century, 1st century BC.
Yeah, the Buddhists, how do they get to Eastern Europe and where they come from?
Well, they came out of India. People moved around in the ancient world. There were trade routes. transportation wasn't as easy as it is today, but
It would take
it was
years.
not that hard.
No, I mean, but the travel time's probably a year. No?
Not necessarily.
They domesticated horses by that time, right?
Well, they had horses and camels, but they had boats.
Okay.
And so, how long does it take to go down the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean? Probably not that long. A week or two. So, anyway, so in other words, the whole world was based. I mean, the whole West was somewhat integrated in the Roman Empire. When Christianity came, one of the things that happened is that parts of it, or some of these various groups, took ideas from Christianity and integrated them into their little syntheses. And so, if you've heard of the Nag Hammadi texts, some of those reflect these early Gnostic groups. Now, there are questions about where some of that stuff comes from originally, and some of it was undoubtedly Gnostic, and some of it comes from heretical sects. Most of it's heretical, but there's a little bit that's not. And so it's definitely not canonical. But that not canonical doesn't mean it's necessarily heretical. So early Christianity got integrated into some of these Gnostic groups. And so, in other words, Egypt was a very fertile place for religion. And that not only applied in Alexandria, it applied all the way down the Nile Basin. And not just in the Nile Basin, but even out into some of the oases in the desert. And again, there was communication. The Nile was a huge river of communication, with people going back and forth all the time from Central Africa, from all over the Nile Basin, not only from Alexandria down, but from all over the Roman Empire into Egypt and down the river, and trade was going on. Egypt was actually became in the 4th century and beyond the main breadbasket for Constantinople. So almost all the grain that was consumed in Constantinople was a city of 1 million people, came from Egypt. Now, think about the size of the cargo ships that had to go between Egypt and Constantinople to keep Constantinople fed. It's huge. So,
what was the population roughly?
Constantinople in the 4th, 5th century, I don't know, 400,000 or 500,000. Later on, over 1 million. So, and Alexandria too was a huge city, several 100,000 people. Jerusalem it doesn't figure in this mix until the 4th century, and Constantine sends his mother Helen to Jerusalem to find the tomb of the Lord and the Lord's cross. And she finds it and has the Roman resources at her beck and call to start building churches. And so Jerusalem, she has the pagan temples knocked down and churches put in their place. And so Jerusalem underwent this radical transformation in the 4th century from basically a pagan city where Jews were forbidden to go to being an entirely Christian city. Just like Constantinople was built on the foundation of a little town called Byzantium, but which had no temples to speak of, no big architecture. And all of whatever pagan infrastructure there was destroyed, and churches were built so that it was an entirely Christian city. And so this movement that happened in the beginning of the 4th century was a radical social transformation. But it also had huge effects on the life of the church. Now, while there were large urban centers of Christianity, cathedrals and parishes had not evolved yet, but there were great cathedrals of, and all the Christians in the city, in any given city, would go to that one church where the bishop was serving to receive communion on Sunday, to go to the liturgy. And so you had the bishop with his presbyters, the elders, who were basically the parish council, and the deacons. And just like you see in a hierarchical liturgy, which is the ancient form of the liturgy, it's basically a dialogue between the bishop, the deacons, and the choir, right? In a hierarchical liturgy. And the priests basically just stand there. They don't do anything, except they may get a line, depending on their seniority. If there's more than 12 of them, they won't get a line. They just stand there. It's a so there was this transformation going on. In 312, Christianity became legal. In other words, the persecutions were stopped. But it wasn't until 381 with Theodosius that that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. A lot of people say, oh, Constantine messed up Christianity and all of that. That's nonsense. They don't know history. And basically, the Protestants are out to lunch when it comes to history. They have no concept. And over the course of the 4th century, things began to develop slowly institutionally within the church. Of course, there were the ecumenical councils in 325 and 381, which quieted some of the heresies and came up with canons for the structure of the church, and also came up with common confession of faith. But it wasn't until 381 when Christianity was made the official religion that you had to be a Christian in order to have a state job. That's essentially what that meant. So it wasn't Constantine, it was Theodosius who messed things up. And so there was this vast influx into the church of people who wanted to be politically correct. They wanted to maintain their state job. They wanted to maintain their salary. And so they had to go be a Christian. Whether they really believed it or not is a different story. Now, up until that time, the churches, most churches, had been relatively small. I mean, some of the big urban churches were immense, but most churches were relatively small. Everybody knew each other. There was, coming out of the period of persecution, there was this intensity of life because of the threat of martyrdom. There was an intensity of spirituality. One had to be ready and able to, and detached enough from everyone and everything that you could just offer yourself in martyrdom. And so the level of the spiritual life in the early church was very, very high. At the end of the 4th into the 5th century, you had this vast influx of the unwashed, in other words, the unbaptized, into the church as catechumens who wanted to keep their jobs, basically. And there was another sociological aspect as well, because for the first 3 centuries, and you see this reflected very much in St. Paul's epistles, where he says, among you there are not many wise, not many noble, not many... What he's saying is, you're all slaves. And in the early church, a vast number of the people, of the members of the church, were slaves. Because in the Roman Empire, in this 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, 60% of the population were slaves. Now, we tend to think, because of our own cultural history, that slave was some kind of racial or ethnic thing. It had, in the Roman Empire, it had absolutely nothing to do with race or ethnicity. Yes, there were black slaves, but there were black nobles as well. It had to do essentially with either being an enemy prisoner who was not killed but brought in and sold, or a captive from someplace, or if you got yourself into debt, you could be sold for so that your debt could be paid off, and you had to be a slave, and not only you could be sold, but your wife and your children could be sold, as well as everything that you owned, which was probably not very much. And we see that reflected in the gospel text too. That was part of the culture of that period. With the advent of the church as the official religion of the empire, you had citizens, Roman citizens, and the upper classes coming in as well. And so there was also, at this time, a vast amount of wealth pouring into the church. Now, think about coffee hour in the year 315 versus coffee hour in the year 415. You know, on one hand, you may have some bread that people could, scavenge together and kind of, with some water, and and you'd be happy together. And in 415 you had what I like to now call the fur-bearing women in their jewels and their and it'd be like walking into the Philopticus, which is nothing against the Philopticus, by the way, but it became very wealthy. So if you were coming out of the mindset of the early church, which lasted well into the 4th century, you would be scandalized, right? You'd be absolutely, completely scandalized. Because here the churches were filled with the unwashed, right? Who didn't know the first thing. They didn't know how to cross themselves. They didn't know how to even go up and light a candle. They didn't know they didn't have any idea about the gospel. They didn't, all they wanted to do was keep their job, and it really didn't have anything to do with being a Christian. And being a Christian was not a matter of life or death. It was a matter of convenience and social status. And so at the first part of the 4th century and before, to be a Christian meant that you had negative social status. You were way below the lowest class. After 381, the nobility had become Christian. And that was a radical thing. Now, one of the primary motives for people to go out into the desert and to form monasteries, or into the wilderness, or into the forest, or the mountains, or wherever it was to preserve the intensity of the life of the early church, to preserve the intensity of martyrdom, to preserve the intensity of being of renouncing the world, and being detached from the world, and being detached from all their relationships and all their stuff, so that they could live entirely for the sake of the kingdom of God. And nothing pushed this more than the publication of a book around the year 360, which was The Life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius, the Archbishop of Alexandria. Maybe 345, maybe say 350. Now, there were already Christian monastic communities that had begun. There was St. Pachomius in Upper Egypt, and he had communities of up to 10,000 people apiece. If you can imagine, 10,000 people in a monastery. They lived in houses of about 20, 25 people, in little villages, and each one had its own elder who would oversee the spiritual life of those. But they lived in community, they worked in community, their whole lives were in community, and they lived in celibacy. And you can read the Rule of St. Pachomius. It's something well worth reading. And so that was written, I don't know, around 330, give or take. You also had St. Macarius of Egypt, who began to organize the hermits, the solitaries who had gone out to live in caves in the desert, into kelia, into cells. They called their hut a cell, or cells. Kelia is the plural, and so they would come together, they would pray together, they would share resources, but they lived separately. And these became the great monastic centers that we read about of the Desert Fathers. So people like St. Basil the Great in his youth, with his buddy, St. Gregory of Nyssa, who became St. Gregory the Theologian, and his little brother, St. Gregory of Nyssa, the theologian was Nazianzen, went down on a trip in their late 20s to live and see what was going on. This is around in the 330s, so it was not too long after these communities were organized, and brought the idea north into Asia Minor, where St. Basil also established a little monastery with his buddy, St. Gregory of Nazianzen, on a family estate. And they accepted the monastic life. You can read all about that in the life of St. Basil. You can read all about what happened with St. John Chrysostom as he began to embrace, as a young man, the solitary life. So this was probably in the 330s again, probably after the Council of Nicaea, where as a young man, like in his late teens, early 20s, he decided he was going to be an ascetic, and he was going to live in a cave, and he was going to fast, and he was going to pray, and he was going to do all of these things. Well, pretty soon he'd fasted himself into being so ill that his friends came and carried him like a corpse to be buried, and laid him out in the church, except he woke up. But they never let him go back because they ordained him. They chased him down, held him down, and ordained him. And so he was stuck. And you can read all about that in his book on the priesthood. And it's well worth reading. In fact, all of the literature from this period, especially the lives of the Desert Fathers and the sayings of the Desert Fathers, which are also in the conferences of John Cassian, and in various books like St. Macarius of Egypt and others of these that have come down to us, and these remain very kind of central books in our tradition, in the monastic tradition, and it paves the way for the later monastic literature, one of which we will be studying. Okay, so is this kind of clear so far? Okay. So, St. Athanasius had been a young deacon who had gone with his bishop to the First Ecumenical Council, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, and when they came back from the council, and so he watched. He was there. He saw Arius, spouting his heresy. He saw St. Nicholas go up and slap him up, as a heretic, and what happened with St. Nicholas, and met St. Spiridon and all of these other great fathers who went to the First Ecumenical Council. Well, St. Alexander died not too long after getting back from the First Ecumenical Council, and he left instructions that his deacon, who was a very young man at the time, be made bishop. He was 29 and a half. And according to the canons, you have to be 30 to be made a bishop. And those canons at that time. And so they stretched things by a few days and made him the Archbishop of Alexandria. Well, that's a big title because, before Athanasius even, that see had the title of Pope, the Pope of Alexandria. In other words, the Father. Pope just means Father. But it's a very kind of exalted title. Pope, Patriarch, Archbishop, Metropolitan. These are all essentially equivalent titles. St. Athanasius was a zealot for the First Ecumenical Council, and for the doctrine that Christ is of the same essence, homoousios, with the Father. He was a zealot for the Nicene Creed. And he fought against Arianism his whole life. Now, unfortunately, Constantine and Constantine's sons leaned towards the Arians. And so Athanasius got exiled 5 times from his see. And he spent time, I think, in Palestine. He spent time in the West, because that was far enough away that he couldn't, mess with things too much. But then, I think in his 3rd or 4th exile, he went down and stayed with St. Anthony in the desert. Now, St. Anthony lived in a cave overlooking the Red Sea on the east side of the mountain range. So you have the Red Sea, you have the mountain range, and then you have the Nile Valley. And so he was on the east side of the mountains, looking down at the Red Sea in this, desert wasteland, basically. St. Athanasius wrote about his life. And that book was probably one of the most influential Christian books in the entirety of history, because it got published and translated into multiple languages throughout the Roman Empire in a very short amount of time. And hundreds and hundreds of people who wanted to have that intensity of spiritual life left the cities and went into the desert. There's a book by Derwas Chitty, C-H-I-T-T-Y, called The Desert a City. And it's about this transformation of the Roman Empire at that time into the host, as it were, for the development of monasticism. Because tens of thousands of people, and some of them went into Egypt. Some just went into the mountains locally. Some went into the desert. Some, all sorts of places, and that continued for a long time. Now in the West, in another 50. Well, okay. So we're talking about mid 4th century. 350 or so, St. Anthony was published. About this time, St. Augustine was a young man. Well, St. Augustine was a Gnostic. He belonged to the Manichaean sect, and that had a very negative influence on his later writings, but we won't go into that. But it was super ascetic. But he wasn't super ascetic, and if you read his book Confessions, one of the more memorable lines is, "Lord, give me chastity, but not yet." And he had a mistress, he had a son, he had and he had a very pious mother who was praying for him, Monica. And eventually, his son, who was like 12 or 13, died. And that just sobered him up. And he converted to Christianity. And he and his companions started an urban monastery, or a brotherhood, where they lived together as celibates, keeping a rule of prayer. And it's the basis of what in the Latin church is called the Augustinian Rule. And it's a rule of for canons. There is what the brothers are called. They're called canons. It's not about canons. When St. Basil and his buddies went to Egypt and lived with the fathers, they went back to Asia Minor. Basil became the Archbishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, or Cappadocia, if you want a more original pronunciation. Which, if you look, what is it now, Caesarea or something like that? Anyway, that's the city that's carved into these hills, and so most of the houses and the churches and everything are caves. And it's a huge city, but it's in this very exotic-looking landscape, and something out of Star Wars,
They filmed one of them there. Yeah.
Yeah.
They actually filmed a Star Wars segment there.
Yeah, but it's quite. I haven't been there yet. I do want to go. But this was the major city in that part of Asia Minor. If you know where Tarsus is, you remember seeing the maps where Tarsus is, where St. Paul was from. You go north from there, and then that's Cappadocia. And it's in the diocese of Antioch. So it's the Antiochian tradition. Well, St. Basil, being being the archbishop there, and being a great proponent of the First Ecumenical Council, fought against the Arians. And so he had his buddy from college, Gregory of Nazianzen, and his little brother, Gregory of Nyssa, and he had these little villages that were under his jurisdiction, and so he made both of them bishops and put them into these strategic locations to try and create a bastion against the Arians, which eventually worked, actually. But of course, St. Gregory of Nazianzen went on to become Archbishop of Constantinople and presided over the Second Ecumenical Council. They had a disciple who was ordained a deacon by St. Gregory the Theologian, whose name was Evagrius. And Evagrius was a brilliant, supremely educated man, highly philosophically educated and extremely talented, who also was a great defender of the Nicene faith. And so he worked with the Cappadocian Fathers, as they're called, up through St. John, the reign in Constantinople of St. John Chrysostom. The Second Ecumenical Council was in 381, and St. Gregory of Nazianzen, the theologian, was ousted from his seat at that council. A few years later, St. John Chrysostom, who was a little bit younger, got drafted. He was a priest from Antioch who was a brilliant orator. Again, somebody who had was brilliantly educated. All of these men were brilliantly educated because they were from that very small part of the church that was from the aristocracy. Otherwise, you wouldn't have such an education. They renounced the world, became monks, except for Gregory of Nazianzen, and he was married. But he was the great mystic of the group. He wrote a book called The Life of Moses, which is mind-blowing. Anyway, between Basil and Gregory the Theologian, there was this deep commitment to community monastic life. But the community monastic life that they had in mind was urban. And it was what in Roman Catholicism is called active life monasticism. The monasteries that St. Basil organized and supported in his diocese were hospitals, hospices, hostels, all of these kind of social service organizations. And the members of the monastic communities worked in the social services. Of course, there were no government social services. It was all church. And so, or the social services that were there were from the church. And St. Basil actually had no use for the solitary life. He said, "What happens when you get lonely, or what happens when you get depressed? You don't have anybody to lift you up. You don't have anybody to help you out. This is no good. It's all selfishness," which is like really quite interesting. When you have one of the greatest fathers of the church criticizing the whole form of ascetic life. So St. Basil's rule that he wrote reflected that idea of the church as and of monastic life as a life of social service. St. John Chrysostom came out of the Syrian form of monastic life, which was solitaries. And by this time, you had three major centers of monastic formation. By the end of the 4th century, you had Egypt, you had Palestine and Syria, and then you had Asia Minor. Asia Minor was focused on community life with active social work. Syria, the entire Syrian Palestinian part of the church in other words, the Syriac-speaking world at the time, was focused on the solitary life, hermits. And so, of course, there were social outreach, and there were, but the hermits were basically lived by themselves in caves and in cells in solitary locations, and it would only be in Syria, for example, that you would have such kinds of heroic solitary asceticism like the Stylites. That wouldn't fly in a community monastery. The abbot would tell them, "Get down here and get to work." Just get off that pillar.
How did they live there? How did they eat?
People their friends would bring food to them. And in Egypt, you had both the solitaries, like St. Anthony, because St. Anthony became the inspiration for the whole monastic movement in particular, or in general, and for the solitaries in particular. And it goes into, in his life was how he got by. But Egypt also was this place of communities of solitaries, which is kind of interesting. That in turn was taken first by St. John Cassian. St. John Cassian was a Roman, and he lived for many years in Palestine and in Egypt, and he was inspired by the monastic movement there, and he wrote 2 books. One is called The Conferences, which is about that thick, and I can only imagine how big it must have been. Oh, what's that? What's that? Okay. I can only imagine how big it was as a manuscript, because it's huge in print. And then he has the Institutes, which is a book that is inspired by the Rule of St. Basil. So St. Pachomius wrote the first rule. St. Basil wrote a much broader rule that received much broader distribution. And then Cassian wrote the Conferences and the Institutes. But Cassian took those to Gaul, where he, near the city of Lyon, began establishing a monasticism throughout the central Gallic countryside. It's way too early to talk about France at this time. The Franks were a German tribe that came 300 years later, 400 years later. Now, at the same, and so you had Augustine in Carthage area, Hippo, which is near Carthage, in northern Africa. He had developed this rule of the canons of the Augustinian Rule, but there were so all these various forms of monastic life were taken to the West and also developed there. So there's a very interesting book by St. Gregory of Tours, which was written, I think, around the year 540, that talks about the monasteries and the ascetics, the saints of Gaul. So, as we get into the 6th century, remember in the 5th century you had 2 major church councils, which resulted in huge schisms. The first council, which is the Council of Ephesus in the year 431, resulted in a schism of much of the Church of the East. Of course, it was very politically incorrect because most of the Church of the East was in the Persian Empire, and to be under the hierarchy of the Church of the enemy empire was really problematic. So there were reasons why it was, because remember in the Roman Empire, the Orthodox Catholic Church was the state church. Orthodox Christianity in the Persian Empire was never a state church. So while it didn't have imperial sponsorship, it also had total freedom. And that's a huge difference. And there was no political undertone to its message. So that's why the missionaries of the Church of the East could go into China, they could go into India, they went into Tibet, they went into all of South Asia, all the way to the Pacific, and I think even into Japan. But there was no political. They simply worked with whatever government, whatever king, or whatever empire they were in. And it's fascinating that there was a metropolitan see in Lhasa, Tibet. There was a metropolitan see in Kabul, Afghanistan. There was a metropolitan see in Xi'an, China.
Wow.
Yeah. And in other words, if there's going to be a metropolitan there, there's got to be a big church there to support, because that's metropolitan was the head of a huge structure, basically. Only it was missionary. Then you had, in 451, you had the Council of Chalcedon. And the Council of Chalcedon also had a political element to it. It was and it pitted the Alexandrians and the Antiochians against each other, as had the Council of Ephesus. There was such rivalry between the two sees that anything that the Alexandrians didn't like, they labeled as Antiochian. In other words, they labeled it as Nestorian. Anything that the Antiochians didn't like, they labeled it as Monophysite. Well, regardless of all of the theology of all of that, what you had were parties that developed, and then there was another element as well. You can't really call it nationalism because you're not talking about nation states, but there were groups that were tired of Roman oppression, essentially, which meant practically in the Syrian East, Greek cultural oppression. And so there was a break because in the Chalcedonian dispute, they essentially rejected a Greek innovation. And so they essentially said, no, we're Orthodox, we're clinging to the tradition of our fathers and to St. Cyril of Alexandria, and that's it. And we're not going to accept these innovations because they're contrary to St. Cyril. So you had large parts of the church in Syria, the church in Egypt, in other words, part of the Antiochian Patriarchate, half the Antiochian Patriarchate, 2/3 Alexandrian Patriarchate, and parts of most of the Armenian Church, and then their subordinate missions. So the subordinate missions of the Church of Antioch was Malankara, India. The subordinate missions of the Church of Alexandria was Ethiopia, which at that time included everything from Yemen to Sudan. It was a huge empire. And so all of that basically went into schism, went into isolation. The emperor tried to reconcile it using a heresy, but that weakened the unity of the empire, and so much of that area fell to the Islamic forces of Islam. In that context, that was in 638 or thereabouts. The Syriac missionaries got to China in 638, but the troops of Muhammad also started conquering the entire southern part of the Roman Empire. Let's backtrack from 7th century to 6th century, or 7th century to the 6th century, and in the middle of the 6th century, you have the reign of Justinian. Justinian reconquered much of the West that had fallen to the barbarians, but he also began to fortify the parts of the empire that were in the eastern Mediterranean against the Persian Empire. So you had the Germans coming from the north and they basically took everything from Croatia to the west. And then you had Islam coming from Arabia, and they swept across northern Africa all the way to Morocco. And then you had the Persian Empire coming in from the northeast, and they had seized Jerusalem and had seized the cross and taken the cross back to Persia. Well, the emperor went, and this was Anastasius before that, went and recovered the cross, and there was this great effort to push the Persians back and to fortify the holdings of the empire in the eastern Mediterranean. One of those fortresses is the monastery of St. Catherine in Mount Sinai. And that monastery was founded in the year 550. It was built on the site of the burning bush at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And it's a massive fortress. And the monastery is inside the walls of the fort. But surrounding this sacred spot, because you have the burning bush there, and it was an oasis in the desert, there had been hermits living for centuries. And in fact, you can go and you go into their caves, which were their dwellings. And so this area had a long history of sanctity to it. One of the things that's very interesting is to read the Pilgrimage of Egeria, E-G-E-R-I-A, or E-G-E-I-R-I-A, or Etheria, who was a Spanish nun at the end of the 4th century. And she made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land, including, end of the 5th century. 4th century. And it included going to Mount Sinai, where before the construction of St. Catherine's Monastery, where she met the hermits. It also talks about the liturgical life of Jerusalem and the holy places at that time, which is very similar to what we do still doing now. This monastery was basically a fortification against the invading empires, but it was also a refuge for the monastic life in order to develop and to develop people, to train monks, to train monastics in the spiritual life, and to be a kind of a beacon of holiness. Right now, it has the oldest library in the world. It's been going since 550. And actually, the librarian is an American. And it's got the largest Syriac library in the world, or at least of Syriac manuscripts, and as well as some of the most ancient biblical texts are either there or from there. And all of that stuff is now online. If you can read ancient Greek or Syriac, you can go check that out. It was into this context that St. John, who wrote the Ladder, went to become a monk and eventually became the abbot of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai, and where he wrote this book. So, that's kind of a long and involved background to this. I hope it helps. It makes sense. Next week we'll talk about the structure of monastic life, as well as the why, the hows, and the whys. What is the real ethos of the spirituality of the monastic life? So, any questions?
What type of monastic was he?
Community. Cenobitic, which means community. But he also lived as a hermit, and so he combines the insights of the eremitic life into the Cenobitic community life. Yeah.
Who do you think Saint Benedict was influenced by primarily in his development of Western monasticism?
It was the rule of Saint Basil and Saint John Cassian. Those two primarily. I think he also traveled and saw the monasteries of the East, if I remember right. I don't remember his life very well, but he started out, I believe, as a hermit, and then a brotherhood started growing around him, and informed by these rules and the example of these other monasteries that had grown up, he wrote his rule. And then his rule was adopted by other houses. But it's still 500 years or 700 years before the development of religious orders in the West. So, which never developed in the East. It was a Western phenomenon. So, have you read the Rule of St. Benedict? It's worthwhile. The brothers at Manton used to say I took too much glee because we would read the Rule of St. Benedict periodically, and that I would take too much glee when it talked about corporal punishment, which was part of it, actually, at that time. basic ethos of the rule of St. Benedict is moderation in all things. And that's why it's very balanced and very and perfect, it's perfectly orthodox. There's nothing unorthodox about it.
Was there a time in early Christianity when Gnosticism was intertwined, or
there were
heresies involved with that?
Well, there were attempts by Gnostics to get in the church, and in the West, one of the biggest problems with the writings of Augustine is that he let some of his Gnostic past kind of influence his. But in the East, the church was very much armed against it. Now, one of the things that you have a problem or a question in the Church of Alexandria, because you had from around the year 200 St. Clement of Alexandria, and then his disciple was Origen, and others. You had the search for Christian gnosis, which means knowledge, but it doesn't mean rational knowledge; it means spiritual knowledge. And Origen, at that time, there was no standard of orthodoxy. There were the scriptures, but there was no canon. There were lots of scriptures, lots and lots and lots of scriptures. And so, some groups, parts of the church accepted some things, others, So, for example, the Ethiopian church still has the Book of Enoch in its canon. Whereas we don't, obviously. Book of Enoch is not Gnostic, but it's, it reflects a very different tradition. So one of the things about Gnosticism is that it was this synthesis, especially in Alexandria, there was this kind of synthesis between Judaism, Christianity, and Neoplatonism. And some of the thinkers like Origen, because he was the first to try and write a systematic dogmatics with no guides, some of his ideas were deeply influenced. Now, there's also other problems with that, though, because his original texts have not survived, and copies of his original texts have not survived. There are only writings of Origen that have been transmitted in translation, which have been commented upon. And you can't tell the difference between the comment and the original text. So Origen may not have been as weird as his critics say he was. Now, some of the Vagarius got really weird. But what it does is it reflects this, some of the ideas that perhaps came from Gnosticism, perhaps came from the First Temple, perhaps came from Neoplatonism. We don't know where the origins of some of it come from. But this, and I'll get into this next week, but this played a big role in the life of the church, because some of these texts are pretty strange. So, for example, so far as presuppositions go, Gnosticism is inherently dualistic. Everything is good and bad, black and white, male, female. All these dual categories line up. So you had good and evil, and male and female, okay? And white and black, and spiritual and material, and so you've got female being associated with evil and material, and and demonic, and all of this kind of stuff, and that's Gnosticism.
Right.
It's radical. That's radical Gnosticism. But you see it reflected in the writings of Augustine. Now, Augustine had zero influence on the development of the Orthodox tradition. He wrote in Latin. By the time he was writing in Latin, nobody in the East cared about Latin. He wasn't translated into Greek for 900 years. So his influence on the Greek tradition was nil. My professor, John Meindorf, who was one of the greatest patristic theologians of the 20th century, said that if Augustine had written in Greek, he would have suffered the same fate as Origen. Condemnation, in other words. Instead, he wrote in Latin at the time when the barbarians were sacking everything. So, take care. It's very interesting. In Orthodox theology, the Greek tradition is not dualistic; it's non-dual. So you've got which is a very different category, a very different way of looking at things than a strict dualism. But we'll go into that more next week. So
the writings where they talk about Jesus as a child and he used his powers and he could, he was kind of like intemperate and he could zap people and use the superpower. Is that by those?
It's Gnostic, but it's also, and I found out where the story of the difference between Jesus and the other little boys is that, when they were playing in the mud and they would make birds out of clay, that his flew away.
Yes.
And that he was with his little buddies and he got, one of his little buddies did something to irritate him and he cursed him and he died. It's the Quran. It's in the Quran.
All those stories got into the Quran.
Those stories are in the Quran.
From those heretical...
Yep. Because the Quran is essentially, comes out of that tradition.
Well, he was influenced by heretical Jews and Christians living in...
Mainly by heretical Christians. And one of the problems, the Roman Empire, having been newly and zealously Christian, they didn't kill the heretics. They exiled them. And so they exiled the Arians to the north. Well, who was in the north? The Germanic tribes. What happened? The Germanic tribes who all converted, and they're the ones who took out Rome, Italy, Gaul, Spain, Morocco, Carthage, and suddenly Arianism reappears, 100 years later after it had been destroyed. They exiled the Nestorians and Monophysites to the east, into the deserts of Arabia. Well, the deserts of Arabia were not empty. And so, what do we get? Islam. It's a very interesting history. Very interesting. Muhammad's mother-in-law was a Christian. His father-in-law was a bishop, a Nestorian bishop, or priest, I don't remember, I think a bishop. So, all of this is deeply intertwined. Yeah.
Can this book be considered a rule, or would you consider it different from a rule?
It's not a monastic rule.
Okay.
A monastic rule, actually, goes and says there are these offices in the monastery, and the abbot does this, and the econom does this, and the cellarer does this, and and the beds have to be made at a certain time, and they have to use these rules for. You can cook with these things, and you can't cook with these things, and they're very. Then another part of the rule says you read so many psalms at this service, and so many psalms at the next service, and in what you do and how you do it, and all of that kind of stuff. So this is much more a spiritual guide to living how to live the spiritual life. So it's, in other words, it's applicable. Yeah.
Grace, is what St. John put in this book, is that kind of like what was already known at that time by a lot of these monks that were practicing in that area, or was this something new?
Oh, it's kind of a distillation of the common wisdom. And it's full of stories. That's one of the neat things about this book, is it's full of stories of individuals and their struggle to live the spiritual life. So, but he also he has a philosophy of monastic life. He has a whole theology, a spiritual theology that he relies on, and I'll talk about that next week. Okay. Very good. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gave us birth to God, the Word, true Theotokos, who magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always known and ever into ages of ages.